I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
It was really dramatic. Rough terrain, cratered, hilly, and I kept thinking, nobody's ever been here before. I'm on the moon.
Hello everyone, welcome to Living History, a special episode of Living History, which comes hot on the heels of the series of special episodes we've done about the 50th anniversary of the Apollo moon landings. Now, if you haven't listened to the other episodes in this series, please go back and do so because they're just incredible. We've got interviews with NASA historians, with scientists, and most importantly, with Charlie Duke, Apollo astronaut Charlie Duke. Charlie flew to the moon and landed as part of Apollo 16. He was the 10th man to walk on the moon. He's one of only 4 men left alive who have set foot on the surface of the moon. So go back and listen to Charlie talking about his experiences in the entire Apollo program. And like always, if you're enjoying what we're doing on Living History, a personal plea from me, please subscribe. Please click that subscription button, and that means you'll never miss out on an episode we've got coming up. And also, give us a star rating, give us a review, click on those stars. Hopefully we're worthy of 5 stars, and write a few words about us, because that puts the message out there to other people that we're doing some hopefully interesting stuff on the podcast, and just means we can create more great content. Today's episode, a pretty special one, really. There's a new movie that's come out called simply Apollo 11, about the moon landings, and it's a documentary about the Apollo 11 mission. And I know what you're going to say, not another documentary about Apollo 11, because there's been literally hundreds that have been made over the course of the years, but this one is pretty special and well worth checking out. It opens in cinemas this week, and it's a documentary that is not dry in any way, shape, or form. There's no narration. There's no boring historians like me just talking about the moon landings. It's all told from the perspective of the astronauts, with some incredible footage, most of which has never been seen before, and some pretty clever audio tricks as well. So the people who made this film have done a wonderful thing. They've uncovered this incredibly high definition footage, that most of which, as I said, had not been seen before. And then they've also catalogued thousands and thousands of hours of audio from mission control, from the astronauts themselves, and then they've married the two together. So it's the story of the Apollo landings told by the people who were there, not told through interviews, but you live the experience of being alongside these people as they planned and executed this incredible mission to the moon. I loved the movie, and I don't say that lightly, because I see a lot of documentaries, and many of which I don't really rate as particularly good on a whole range of subjects. So this one is exceptional. It is a wonderful movie, and I highly recommend you go and see it, particularly in the movie theaters, because you want to see it on a big screen. It's absolutely extraordinary. And so I was lucky enough to speak to Steven Slater, who was one of the people that worked on putting this film together. He worked in the archive to dig up a lot of this footage and audio that makes this movie so special. So please enjoy listening to this interview with Steven Slater about Apollo 11, and go out and see the movie. You'll really enjoy it. Stephen, thanks so much for taking the time to join us on Living History.
Really nice to be here.
This movie, I saw it a couple of days ago, and I have to say it was pretty astonishing. It's a remarkable achievement. Give us a little bit of a background into how this wonderful project came together.
Well, the film team behind this, particularly the director, Todd Douglas Miller, Tom Peterson, the producer, and Matt Morton, the composer, we'd worked together previously on a film called The Last Steps, which was all about Apollo 17. So it told the story of the last trip to the moon in a very similar style. No interviews, no narration, just you're going to experience this mission kind of as it happened, fly on the wall sort of thing.
Because that's quite unusual, isn't it, for this style of documentary? There's a lot of documentaries around at the moment about Apollo, and a lot of them are talking heads, very dry.
The astronauts saying the same old stories again and again, and sound bites. You
obviously had a very different vision with what you wanted to do with this film.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's Todd's. I suppose this style is kind of Todd's vision, because we did it with Apollo 17, and I'd worked on other space documentaries. I've become a bit of a kind of pigeonholed as someone who's a specialist in that area, particularly with the archival. I worked on a documentary called The Last Man on the Moon, which was about Gene Cernan, who was the commander of Apollo 17. And actually, it was Todd who approached me and said, we'd like to do something just with the Apollo 17 archive. And I had a huge collection of this archive. I was like, yeah, go at it. And I'm not always expecting huge results when people ask to work with me or whatever. And then they came back a few months later. Well, first of all, I seen a rough cut and I'd given notes and that kind of thing. But we premiered the film at the Hamptons Film Festival in late 2016. And it was just a beautiful piece of work. I was so impressed by what they'd done. And actually, it was in the bar in East Hampton after the screening. I just said to Todd, "Look, I've done a lot of work, primarily with the 16 millimeter film shot in Mission Control during Apollo." So we can go into that in more detail. But basically, it was B-roll film that NASA cameramen would shoot. And I'd undertaken this crazy project to try and manually add sound to this footage. That they didn't have sound recordists. I just wanted to know what the guys were saying, and have it in the correct historical timeline. And I'd done that in my spare time for the previous few years. And I said to Todd, look, 50th anniversary is coming up. I think we could do something quite special with using that and the onboard film and similar style that we've done with The Last Steps. And then it mushroomed into what you saw the other day, which is like a giant screen experience with all this 70mm film.
So basically, as I saw it, it was a collection of absolutely astonishingly high quality footage from the 70mm footage, amazing colour footage. And then it basically was a documentary that told the story of Apollo 11 without narration, without boring interviews. It was just, and I found it an incredibly engaging way to tell the story. This combination of wonderful footage, most of which hadn't been seen before, and then, as you said, the audio as well. So you could hear what the guys in Mission Control were saying. You could hear how the astronauts were responding. Have I summed it up fairly well as to what you're trying to
and
show?
that was the aim. And the aim was to kind of make people feel like they were there in some respect, and to put a huge amount of time into the sound design and making it feel right, and also making it accurate. And that was where my story with this started, I suppose, with the Mission Control film, is to get it into the right, so you were actually seeing the moment when we landed on the moon in Mission Control. We're not just seeing a console or a guy smoking a cigarette or a flashing light or something, because filmmakers can be very lazy. They'll just use any of this archive to try and show the point they want to make. I'm not really into that. Sometimes you can use something representationally, but by and large, we try and stick with the actual footage shot at that moment, or as close to as possible. We're not just seeing a controller in a yellow shirt suddenly switching to a white shirt. It was filmed on that day or close to that time, and so it was my job to get all that in order. And having done a lot of that before, I built on that sort of tenfold to aid the editing of this film. And then the 70mm stuff came along, which we haven't really talked about, but that's a whole nother element. Well,
let's talk about that now, because that was an astonishing aspect of the film, was that 70mm footage. So tell us about that and the role it plays in the film.
Yeah, so one thing that's another thing that's very important to us is we always try and find the source material for anything we're using. So if we're talking about 16mm film, which we were with the Mission Control footage, and all the flight film that the astronaut shot is 16mm. What we ideally want to do is we need to track down the film that was in the camera and use the best scanner, modern technology, to scan that into high definition to give people a cinematic experience. And so we started on this premise that we're going to use some of that stuff. We need to track down all the best source reels, and they're in a place called the National Archives in Maryland in the US, which is the end repository for any film shot by the US government ends up there. And we were speaking with the archivist there about getting the source reels for all this stuff. And then we got an email, it was on May the 10th, 2017, from the head archivist at the Motion Picture Division, saying, by the way, guys, we've just come across 160 reels of 70mm film. About a third of it we think is related to Apollo 11. We're not quite sure what's on it, but it appears to be in very good condition. What do you think? This could change the direction of the project substantially. And I was just stunned when we got that news.
Well, it's quality, isn't it? The quality of this footage, because it's 70mm, just the quality of that footage is quite astonishing. I couldn't believe it when I was watching it. It's in colour, it's magnificent, clear, crisp footage. It looks like it was shot today.
Yes, when we got the email, I had some idea about what this could be, because I'd actually worked on a film called a restoration of a film. I say restoration in inverted commas, called Moonwalk 1 for the 40th anniversary. So this was a cult film that was made, that NASA commissioned at the time, to sort of document that first lunar landing. And they had a really avant-garde director to shoot stuff like all the scenes on the beach and people watching the launch and all that kind of thing. And so I knew that had been shot. I knew he'd shot it in 70mm, but all we had was the finished film, and we had like a 35mm print of that film. So we knew that the cinematography was very good and stuff, but my understanding had been that those reels had been destroyed. And I found paperwork to that effect that said they'd been destroyed. And so when we got the email, I immediately thought, okay, this must be something to do with Moonwalk 1. And we found out not only was it all the Moonwalk 1 source reel, so the rushes, so effectively everything these cameramen were shooting at the time, but it was also, NASA appeared to have employed 70mm crews to cover all aspects of this mission. So not just the day of the launch, there was all the recovery on the USS Hornet, there was the training, and there was also a lot of stuff from other missions like Apollo 8, 9, 10, and 12, just in this pristine quality. And I've seen every frame of it, and it's mind-blowingly good.
And then talk to me about the audio as well, because this was, I assume, one of the greatest challenges that you had to undertake in your role in the film, but also something that adds a wonderful layer and a wonderful depth to the film, because for the first time we can hear what they're saying in mission control. We can hear what the astronauts are saying. Tell us about the audio and the challenge that was to put together.
I'd become aware of a project by the University of Texas in Dallas to digitize what's called the 30-track audio tapes. So these are basically all of the controllers in that room have headsets on, and then there's another back room of their support teams that have headsets on, and that audio is all going on to 30, it's actually 62 tapes running concurrently with 60 channels of audio, which adds up to 11,000 hours of audio through the whole mission. A colleague of mine, Ben Feist, who is from Toronto, I provided him with all of this raw audio. So literally, this team at the University of Texas had designed a playhead to specially play this stuff back. Like, one didn't exist. So it was a huge research project to get the audio off these tapes. And I provided all the audio to Ben. We got, months of emails trying to get the stuff out of them, but eventually we got access to this audio, sent it to Ben, and what Ben found was that it all had inbuilt flutter. So it was all wavering. It wasn't good quality. There was some problem with the playhead. He would be the person to describe all the technical machinations behind that. But what it meant was that we couldn't lock it into the mission time. So he actually found he's a software developer, but there was another man he found in Europe who had written some code that could correct for this flutter. And he did that across the entire 9-day mission. So now that allowed me to go, or Todd, or anyone, the director, to go to any point on a project and find out what was happening and what those guys were saying at any point in the whole mission, because it was also locked to the timeline of the mission. And so we couldn't have done it without that work to sort that out. And actually, he's now launched a website called apolloinrealtime.org, where you can go to any time in the mission and you can on-off those controllers and listen to what they're saying. And all the synced mission control footage is also there. So that's the final element to this, is to make something that we can visually see in the film. I could then use that and lip sync to controllers who were, so it might be, let's say, the FIDO officer or the retro officer. There's a shot of him gold fishing. We think it's around 102 hours into the mission. I'll go to Ben's timeline, isolate his audio, and try and lip sync it to when he might be speaking. And 9 times out of 10, we managed to do that.
It's absolutely extraordinary. The effect that has on the film is, it's a documentary, but I had to remind myself that it wasn't a Hollywood blockbuster because there's just so much going on and you're so immersed in it. The soundtrack was amazing as well, the musical score. Tension is the word I would describe. The excitement of that launch when that Saturn V takes off, the tension as the separations are occurring in space and trying to dock, and then the final 13 minutes where they land. Just the whole thing was just immersive from an emotional experience. So you did a brilliant job of drawing the viewer in from my perspective, because documentaries to me are also they're always a little bit isolating. You don't feel like you're part of the story. You feel very much like you're observing what's going on. But in this one, you definitely were drawn into the story and felt very much a part of the story. Was that an effect that the whole team was going for with this documentary?
Yeah, I mean, my element, I mean, a lot of that is in the vision of Todd Miller, the director, and the way he edited it and the way he was inspired by very much cinema verite sort of films like Woodstock and these special venue films that they had with the like fractured narrative and that kind of thing. That was a big influence on him. For me, the influence or the motivation is, I suppose, to make it as if, to find archive as if it was material that he'd shot. So when you're putting those real words into the controllers' mouths, actually, you're making it as if Todd had a film crew in the room and he was filming it at the time. Whereas before, in a lot of the Apollo documentaries, you would just see this randomly assembled stuff. There's an alarm. Oh, we'll just show a shot of a flashing light on a console. We're just trying to artificially create drama. And that's lazy filmmaking for me. This is getting back to the roots, the original source, and finding the source reels and everything's all very important to me. So that's where I put my focus, and then hopefully it lifts the project.
What was your biggest technical challenge during this film, Stephen?
Well, personally, the syncing of the audio is just an immense psychological problem in many ways. You're trying to read people's lips. You're looking for reference points. You have to have a completely unnatural understanding of what was going on. You have to be very sad in many ways. You have to not have much of a social life, because you could spend like 4 days just trying to match up one bit of audio. Because I think people don't really understand when they see someone speaking in the film. It wasn't like that originally. It's had to be essentially created from scratch, and I've done that. So that's the thing I'm most proud of, but also was the biggest challenge. I mean, technically, scanning at 8K the 70mm film was a huge technical challenge. I mean, I'm not taking any of the credit for that. We had a team in New York who designed a custom-built scanner that could deal with this stuff, and because it's the only one that exists, and it could allow them to scan this material in a reasonable time frame and get us to use it in the film. And it was the data rates and the disk space to store all that stuff is just mind-blowing. It was like there's over a petabyte of data, which is 1,000 terabytes of data of all this stuff.
Just astonishing. I mean, in the film itself, let's talk a little bit about some of the things we saw on the screen, because I was quite surprised at a number of aspects. One of the things that struck me when I was watching the film is, in spite of the seriousness, in spite of what was at stake during this mission, how much humour came to the fore. There were often little jokes and pithy comments made. I remember the scene where Buzz Aldrin was going down the ladder onto the moon, and he actually was making a comment about how I've been careful not to lock the door behind me because we will want to get back up here. Did you find that when you were making the film, that I was surprised by the levity that often injected itself into these very serious moments? Did you find that in your experience with this footage and audio?
Yeah, and there was a lot of off-guard moments. I mean, Mission Control, you'd hear a guy just calling his calling his wife to say what time he'd be home, because they would do that and it would somehow have been recorded in the official record. The astronauts have been portrayed a lot as sort of automatons. I mean, even Neil Armstrong, I think it was in First Man, he comes across as, this is the Ryan Gosling film, he comes across as very serious with no sense of humour. I don't find that at all. I think he had a really good sense of humour, and he's understated but dry, and it comes across when you're really familiar with the audio.
Do you feel that you're closer now to these men as human beings? That, as we say, these are some of the most famous people in the world, the first men to walk on the moon. Do you feel you now know more about them as human beings through this process of creating this film?
Yes, yeah, I do. I mean, I actually met Buzz Aldrin a few weeks ago for the first time. That was quite an amazing moment, and they were involved with screening the film and helping with the technical accuracy of it. Yeah, I always you learn something new every day. You listen to this stuff, and yeah. So the answer is yes, emphatically, yeah.
I thought something that also came through in the film was the idea that this wasn't just an American project. Obviously, it was America that was seeking glory in landing on the moon, but constant mentions throughout the film of mankind, the plaque that they left, "We came in peace for all mankind." Do you think that that's part of the Apollo story, that it was something bigger than just the Americans?
Mike Collins has given quite a lot of interviews where he talks about the astronauts embarked on a worldwide tour called the Giant Step Tour shortly after they came out of quarantine in the autumn of 1969. And Australia was one of the places they came to visit. They visited Sydney and Perth, and there's a lot of very good film of them. But they also went to the Middle East. They went to Canada, the UK, Europe, and everywhere. Mike Collins would say that people said, "We did this." Not Americans did it. We did it. It was we, mankind, did it. And yeah, that struck me as quite powerful, that people were subconsciously associating it, even at the time, with everyone, not just the US.
When you look back on the finished product of that film now, what are the special moments for you? What are the moments in that film that you're most proud of? Were there any moments that you were really delighted to bring to the screen for the first time? What are those special moments for you in the film?
My favourite archive is actually, you'd expect me to probably say something about to do with the space mission. It's not at all. It's actually the film of the public at the time arriving at the launch site on the beaches near Cape Kennedy, station wagons, glasses and haircuts in that period fashion. It blows me away, that, because it's like a real time capsule of the time. Someone at the time said, we're going to document this in the best way we can. It's a time capsule so that in the future people will be able to see what it was like at this time when we did this amazing thing. I
agree with you that for me the biggest impact was actually the first half of the film, not the moon landing, but the first half, when you saw the astronauts getting ready, when you saw them, when you saw the huge Saturn V being loaded into place, when you saw the incredible chopper footage. There's a great scene of a helicopter flying along, filming holiday makers who'd come out to watch the launch. People getting out sandwiches and picnics and getting set up for the launch. Obviously the moon landing sequences of the film are very engaging. They always will be, man landing on the moon. But that first half, to me, when it was showing those extra elements that you don't normally think of, I thought that was an absolutely extraordinary part of the film.
Well, that was the main public interface, was the launch. That's when people got to experience this thing. People experienced the moon landing itself, the walk on the moon, at a real remove. They were watching it on ghostly black and white television sets. There are, God knows how many documentaries are coming out. As we're speaking, it's the week of the anniversary, and it's just every other night there's something new on. And these documentaries, they tend to show shots of people around the world watching the moonwalk. And while it was clearly a very special moment, it leaves me cold a little bit, because I just feel like a lot of people's memories about that are quite rose-tinted. It probably was actually quite boring. It was very technical. It wasn't.
And it went for a long time as well. It took the broadcast of the moon landing went on for a very long time.
There's a lot of time when they're not saying anything, and it's not the edited piece that we've done. Clearly, it was a impactful moment for people. But I think something like the launch, when you can see people actually experiencing something viscerally rather than someone watching a TV screen, that means a lot more to me.
There's also a very strong technical reason for that to be so compelling, because when you're on the ground before the vehicle takes off, they've got lots of cameras, they've got lots of people filming, whereas obviously once it's just three blokes up in space, they're limited to what they can record. So I was just blown away by the breadth of what they had shot in the lead up to the launch. It was absolutely incredible.
Yeah, I mean, there's that first 30 minutes for me is probably the highlight, I would say. And you could say that it's in a way it's all downhill from there, but I don't agree. I mean, I think it's some of the scenes of recovery, for example. My favourite scene in the film is the rendezvous. So Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin took off from the moon, and Michael Collins set a 16mm movie camera in the window of Columbia, the command module, and the sequence in the film, for the first 30 seconds, you're just seeing the lunar surface go by, and then very, very gradually, this little dot just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and comes into view, and then it starts pirouetting, and it's a beautiful display of orbital mechanics, and it's backed by Matt Morton, our composer, doing this beautiful cue, which I cried actually when I saw it the first time.
I agree with your assessment of that scene, because I was the same. I was sitting in the theatre going, "Oh, that's a really lovely shot of the moon as the command module, orbits the moon." And I thought, I'm surprised they're holding on this shot for so. My technical mind came in a little bit. And I'm like, I'm surprised they're holding on this shot for so long, because it's lovely, but it seems to be a very long time just showing the surface of the moon. And then you're right, you see this little dot just appear, which is the lunar vehicle returning. It was just a wonderful scene, just very, very well done.
Yeah, and that's where you have to give Todd, the director and editor, just so much credit for letting the material breathe. Other films I've seen would just cut this thing to shreds. Why would you want to cut away from that shot?
Or some technical diagram showing how beautiful. They came together.
Or some the thing I really hate is these cards, captions that come up on screen describing what's going to happen. Like, oh, there will be the 1201 alarm meant blah, 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 blah. And it's like, that just takes me completely out of the moment. I just want to experience it. And maybe I don't need to know everything that alarm meant.
Stephen, you've been very close to the Apollo story for a very long time now. You've literally put words into the mouths of the people that were there. What's the legacy of all this for you? Why was it important that we went to the moon? Is it still important 50 years later that we did this? What's the legacy of the Apollo program to you?
It's a very, very big question. I think it just shows what we can do as a species when we put our minds to it, when we have a goal. Like Kennedy set that goal before this decade is out, we will do this, and then we did it. So I think it's a very optimistic message that it sends. But also it's... I don't know. There's something strange was going on at the time. It's like it's a bit like they took a decade from the late 21st century and put it into the 20th century. I mean, the day that shot we talked about was filmed of the lunar module coming up and rendezvousing, the Beatles started recording Abbey Road. So, and I was thinking about this recently. In 500 years' time, what's going to be remembered from that time? Probably the music of the Beatles will be, and going to the moon. So these are things that are going to last a long time. How much of what's happening today will really live that long? That's just my view. That's a cultural thing, and so there's a cultural and a scientific thing that were happening on the same day, and they haven't been matched. You could really argue that, like, the music of the Beatles hasn't been matched, and going to the moon hasn't been matched.
I heard another historian discussing this say that really, when you think about it, probably the only person who, from the 20th century, who is likely to be remembered in the 25th century is probably going to be Neil Armstrong. It won't be Hitler. It won't be any of these other people we think are so important in today's world. Neil Armstrong is potentially the only person from the 20th century who will still be relevant in the 25th century. And right or wrong, that just sums up the significance of what was achieved in 1969.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's odd. It's maybe odd that he would be remembered personally because he was one of many people who were qualified to do that. Obviously, he did an amazing job. I think the achievement is more important than any one person.
I think you're right too, and it's the best demonstration of a collaborative achievement you probably could have is the 400,000 people involved in the moon landing.
But I find it interesting. I mean, what do you? You're a historian. What do you think will last from the 20th century? It's sort of.
That's a really good question. I think the dark moments like World War II and Hitler, I think, endure. I think we always, as humans, remember those dark moments, and maybe that's where Apollo comes in. Maybe in what was a very dark century, the 20th century was characterized by wars and death on a destruction on a scale we'd never seen before, and maybe that's why Apollo shines out, because it was a demonstration of people coming together, and even the fact that it began in this sort of space race and the Cold War, it grew out of that, but became something so much more. So I'm hopeful as a historian that Apollo 11 is a representation of the good of mankind in a world where we tend to focus a lot on the negative.
I agree, but I mean, I would also say that it was quite an ephemeral thing. I mean, people forget that 3 years afterwards, when Apollo 17 went to the moon, everyone had moved on. People weren't watching. We are very ephemeral as a species. So I think it's interesting having all this re-interest again 50 years later, and I mean, hopefully our film contributes to that. But will people move on after the anniversary and not think about it again until the 60th? I don't know. Is it something that's always in people's minds? I don't know. I'd be interested to find out.
It's a very good question, but what I should say is, for the time being, while we are interested, go and see this film. It's an absolutely extraordinary achievement, and the film is opening this week across Australia. And Stephen, your contribution to it was absolutely vital, obviously. And again, we're talking about great collective achievements like the Apollo campaign. This film is another one. I thought it was absolutely brilliant, and just thank you so much for taking the time to talk about it today.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you for having me.